Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Irene Hausinger, and this is the lecture for Chapter 5 in your Uppers, Downers, All-Arounders book, continuing with Downers, alcohol. Alcohol is so special that it gets its own chapter because it's really its own beast. It's certainly related to the other depressants, but it's very unique, and so we're going to take the time to explore it. Historically, the acceptability of alcohol has been intertwined with cultural, social, and financial imperatives. 2 billion people worldwide and about 135 million in the United States drank alcohol regularly last month. About 17 million Americans are considered heavy drinkers. It is important to note that if we have a pie chart and the pie chart represents substance use problems worldwide and in the United States, 80% of those substance use problems are alcohol related, while the other 20% are other substances. I'm going to say that again because it's really important. 80% of substance use problems are alcohol related. Alcohol. And then the other 20% are all the other substances. And this has been very, very consistent. It's been consistent. Even when we have other epidemics and things that come up, alcohol is, we could say, public enemy number one. Okay. Alcohol is the oldest legal psychoactive drug in the world. Islamic countries are the exception. And so in Islamic countries, you are going to see other substances, particularly opium, as a primary drug of choice. Right. Alcohol has a really long history. Around 10,000 years ago, grain was cultivated for bread and alcohol. There's a really great documentary called How Beer Saved the World. And alcohol has played a role in survival. So before we had the technology to filter our water and to clean our water, a lot of water was unsafe to drink, and this is still true. There's a lot of water in the world that's unsafe to drink, and so through the process of fermentation, we were able to make alcohol and then stay hydrated. And so I do recommend this documentary, How Beer Saved the World. And I also want to point out, and we'll talk about this a little bit later in the chapter, not all alcohol is created the same. Not all alcohol is created the same. So it's really important for us when we're working with clients to look at what type of alcohol are you drinking, how much, how often, have you switched to different types of alcohol, how do you react to different types of alcohol, etc. Okay. Throughout history, society's laws and morals regarding alcohol have wavered from prohibition and temperance to unrestricted consumption. The prohibition of alcohol in the United States lasted from 1918 to 1933. Until an income tax was levied, taxes on alcohol, excise taxes is what they're called, had been a significant part of federal and state budgets. Alcohol consumption in China and India has doubled in recent years, and Russia has the highest rate of consumption. Russian men consume the equivalent of 6 to 7 bottles of vodka per capita per year. And a lot of that has to do with the Russian climate and geography and access to clean water. So once again, do not underestimate the importance of geography, climate, borders, etc. I think that we might jump right to looking at the quality of the substances, but where you are in the world, what's happening in the world, what your climate is like, what your geography is like, really has a huge impact on the types of drugs and substances that are there, how they're made, how they're synthesized, and the use rates for sure. Let's look at the chemistry of fermentation, which is the process of creating alcohol. There are other things that are fermented. Chocolate is fermented, sourdough is fermented, kimchi, etc. And so this is the basic process. So we have sugar from berries, vegetables, or grain, and we expose that sugar to yeast. And through chemistry, we get ethyl alcohol, which is the psychoactive component. And then we add that to carbon dioxide, which gives us the bubbles, right? That carbonation there. There are so many different types of alcohols. Some are made naturally through fermentation, whereas those that are used industrially are synthesized, for example, distilling. Ethyl alcohol, or ethanol, is the main psychoactive component in all alcoholic beverages. And you might see it on a bottle of alcohol, AV, alcohol volume. Beer is 5% to 9% alcohol. Today, that's not the case. It goes up a lot higher than that. When we hit 27%, that's actually coming into something called a barley wine. But there are microbrews that are 11% and 18%. So again, all alcohol is not considered the same. And it's really important to note that depending on what you're drinking, you could become intoxicated faster. So drinking something like a Coors Light or a Budweiser or a PBR is going to be very different than having a highly concentrated microbrew that is 11 or 12%. So you're thinking like a PBR or something like that is 5%. A microbrew could be twice that in the alcohol content. Wine is generally 12 to 15%, and distilled liquor is 40 to 50%. And then you have things like moonshine and white lightning and things that are 90 proof. So again, it's not all equal. It's very important to get to that level of detail. Beer is produced from fermented grain. Wine is produced from fermented fruit. Mead is produced from honey. Distilled spirits have varying concentrations of alcohol and are made from fermented grains, tubers, vegetables, and other plants. You can make parsnip wine and potato vodka, and if you look at some of these old farm books, you can make a lot of parsnip and parsley wine and dandelion wine and a whole bunch of different things. Spirits can also be distilled from wine or other fermented beverages. So if you have a wine, you can run it through a still and get a brandy or something like that. Let's look at how it is metabolized. So you have alcohol and alcohol dehydrogenase, which is then, so alcohol is absorbed by the body at different rates depending on weight, gender, age, and a dozen other factors such as what did you have to eat, do you have any health concerns, etc. The absorption of alcohol into the bloodstream takes place at various sites along the gastrointestinal tract, including the stomach, mostly in men, not in women. So in the stomach, alcohol absorption happens, but in women, not until the small intestine and the colon, which is one of the reasons why men can have a higher tolerance, because the enzyme starts working in the stomach. And so women are going to feel the effects faster and longer in general. Okay. Once alcohol crosses the blood-brain barrier, psychoactive effects begin. Women register higher blood alcohol concentrations, BAC, than men from the same amount of alcohol because they absorb 30% more alcohol into the bloodstream than do men of the same weight. Women feel its psychoactive effects faster and more intensely. Alcohol is metabolized at a steady rate, mostly by the liver, and subsequently excreted through urine, sweat, and breath. The higher the blood alcohol content, the more severe are the effects. A BAC of 0.08 is considered legal intoxication in every state in America. The United States has a very high BAC. Other countries, the tolerance for driving is much, much, much lower. Sometimes in Japan, there's zero. It's zero. In other countries, it might vary depending where you go from 0.02 to 0.06 country to country. The actual reaction and level of impairment varies widely and depends on a person's drinking history, behavioral tolerance, mood, age, and a dozen other factors. So when alcohol is excreted through urine, sweat, and breath, chronic late-term alcoholics, when the liver and the excretory systems are breaking down, they might not be intoxicated, but you can smell the metabolite through the skin, and there is an odor to it because they've been drinking for so long and at such a heavy rate that the body is basically backlogged and can't filter it out fast enough. Excuse me. So we have alcohol plus alcohol dehydrogenase. We're going to say this. acetaldehyde. That's probably incorrect, but there we go. Acetaldehyde dehydrogenase, acetic acid and oxygen, and then carbon dioxide plus water and energy. Okay. The varying availability and the metabolic efficiency of ADH and ALDH, due in part to hereditary factors, account for some of the variation in people's reactions to alcohol. And your chapter discusses racial and ethnic and gender differences. So here we have drink equivalency, which is very important. And I like to have this printed out as a chart when I'm working as a counselor because it helps me figure out blood alcohol levels and figure out what's going on with the client. So again, and I can't stress this enough, not all alcohol is the same. The BAC table is a measure of the concentration of alcohol in an average drinker's blood. Other versions of BAC tables show slightly lower levels, but the differences are minimal. Every state defines legal intoxication at 0.08, regardless of the driver's ability to function. So if a person doesn't drink very often, they might feel a rush and feel tipsy with one drink. It's entirely possible. If you have somebody that got arrested with a BAC of like 0.2, they've been drinking for a really long time because most people wouldn't even be able to walk to the car or have the thought processes and motor actions to walk to the car, put the keys in the ignition, and all of the things that you have to do to drive a car. Okay, so that shows long-term use. Okay, so when someone says, I had one drink, and their BAC is 0.16, twice the legal limit, we know that that can't be the case. What is one drink? Did you fill up an entire pint glass full of vodka? So the measurement here is really important. 1.5 ounces of brandy will give you the same BAC as 1.5 ounces liquor with a mixer, like a mixed drink. 1.5 ounces of straight up liquor, 12 ounces of beer, 7 ounces of malt liquor. So this is like Steel Reserve and 211 and Mad Dog and that type of thing. 5 ounces of wine or 10 ounces of wine cooler. So if you look at malt liquor, these are often sold in 16-ounce cans. And so that's a lot of alcohol. So again, we have to look at how it's packaged, how many ounces, what is the AV content, etc. Okay, so let's look at the blood alcohol levels here. When enough drinks are consumed, the depressant effects of the alcohol take over. Expectation, setting, and the mood of the drinker cease to have a strong influence at that point. Blood pressure is lowered, motor reflexes are slowed, digestion and absorption of nutrients become poor, body heat is lost as blood vessels dilate, and sexual performance is diminished. I believe the term in country music is whiskey dick, and there's a famous, I think there's a famous song actually called Whiskey Dick. Okay, so let's look at this. So at 0.01 here, up to 0.5. Most people are going to be in a coma at this point. Every once in a while you hear of someone that has a DUI or was caught and they had a BAC of 0.46. That is something that if the person's even awake and functioning is pretty incredible because you can die at that point. So a person that has a BAC that is that high has been a long-term drinker, a heavy drinker for a really long time. So with one drink, we might have some lowered inhibitions, feeling relaxed, lack of anxiety, some loss of muscular coordination, your alertness becomes decreased, reduced social inhibitions. It's very common for people to regret sexual decisions that they've made under the influence. Then we have an impaired ability to drive at this point, further loss of coordination, slowed reaction time, exaggerated emotions, unsteadiness standing or walking, hostile, argumentative, and often hostile behavior, clumsiness, slurred speech, the inability to walk without help, confused speech, incapacitation, loss of feeling, difficulty in rousing, life-threatening unconsciousness, coma, and death from heart or lung failure. Sorry, we're having cat attitude problems here. Okay. So there are levels of use. Alcohol use ranges from abstinence, experimentation, and social recreational drinking to habitual use, abuse, and addiction. So when the DSM changed in 2013, now we're seeing this reflected as a spectrum, alcohol use spectrum disorder. Okay. In low to moderate dose episodes, if a person is not at risk, for example, if they're not pregnant, genetically susceptible, or in recovery, documented health benefits from light alcohol use include sedation, muscle relaxation, some heart benefits, and lowered inhibitions. It is recommended if you have a heart condition sometimes to drink a glass or two of red wine every night. The inhibitory neurotransmitter GABA, the mood modulator serotonin, the reward neurotransmitter dopamine, and glutamate, which is a receptor site enhancer, are most affected by alcohol. Alcohol increases sexual desire while slightly decreasing erectile ability in males. In high-dose episodes, a range of effects occurs from decreased alertness and exaggerated emotions to shock, coma, and death. Effects are directly related to the amount, frequency, and duration of use. Effects also depend on the user's tolerance to alcohol. Alcohol poisoning causes central nervous system depression, which can result in respiratory arrest and cardiac failure. Blackouts, otherwise called amnesia, are common among alcoholics. A blackout is where you don't remember anything. A brownout is remembering parts of what's going on when you're drinking a lot. Hangovers usually pass within a day, whereas withdrawal can last for days or weeks. Hangover remedies are not very effective. Rest and time eliminates the alcohol. You can't reverse intoxication with coffee. If you eat before you drink, then the absorption rate is going to be different. But if you drink and then eat, you're not going to have the same effects there. You can't reduce your blood alcohol level. With chronic high-dose use of alcohol, depending upon a drinker's habits and susceptibility, organ damage, particularly alcoholic hepatitis and cirrhosis of the liver, cardiovascular problems, CNS damage, gastrointestinal damage, reproductive disruption, cancer, especially breast cancer, and impaired sexual, mental, for example, memory, and emotional processes are common. Alcohol has a direct toxic effect on organs and tissues. The lifespan of chronic high-dose drinkers is 10 to 22 years shorter than the general population. Alcohol is directly responsible for 130,000 deaths each year in the United States, and that is only second to smoking-related deaths, which is about 480 to 500,000 individuals in the U.S. every year. So even though we do have problems with heroin and opiates, the legal substances of tobacco and alcohol have consistently been killing more people every year. Consistently. Let's look at addiction. Drinkers generally don't distinguish between hangover and true withdrawal symptoms. They are a little bit different. Historically, there have been many attempts to classify alcoholism as a disease. Benjamin Rush, Thomas Trotter, and E.M. Jelinek are some of the key researchers. Modern classifications have been aided by the discovery of the nucleus accumbens, endorphins, and enkephalins, and the development of genetic research tools and imaging techniques. Alcoholism is a primary chronic disease with genetic, psychosocial, and environmental factors influencing its development. Various studies place the influence of genes on alcoholism and other addictions at 40 to 60%. The environment, particularly physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, raise susceptibility to addiction. The actual use of drugs or the practice of compulsive behaviors are precursors to habituation, abuse, and addiction. Tolerance defends a user against the toxic effects of alcohol. The liver becomes able to handle more and more alcohol, but eventually it reaches a point of declination, especially as the drinker gets older. Because the body's tissues have become dependent on the continued use of alcohol, stopping suddenly results in the onset of withdrawal symptoms that can range from hangover-like symptoms such as headaches to severe and occasionally life-threatening reactions such as convulsions. So here we have the fatty liver of a moderate to heavy drinker is caused by the accumulation of fatty acids. When drinking stops, the fat deposits usually disappear. Cirrhosis of the liver usually takes 10 or more years of steady drinking to develop. There is a rare form of non-alcohol induced cirrhosis as well, but it is very, very rare. So when you hear cirrhosis, most of the time it's going to be alcohol induced, but there are exceptions. Cirrhosis of the liver, it takes a long time to develop. Okay. The toxic effects of alcohol cause scar tissue to replace the healthy tissue. This condition remains permanent even when drinking stops. Okay. And in some cases, people might have to have a liver replacement. Much of the current research in the field of alcohol dependence involves identifying the precise biological mechanisms involved in the development of addiction, genes, and epigenetic changes. Studies are being done to identify and modify environmental causes of alcoholism. New drugs to reduce craving and relapse are one of the current directions in clinical research. So here we have a picture of a normal heart and then a fatty and enlarged heart of heavy drinkers. So you can see from the previous slides, fatty tissue here in the liver and then fatty tissue here. Okay. Alcohol causes hypertension and damages heart muscles directly, making for an increased risk of stroke and heart disease. But remember, moderate alcohol drinking can help heart health, but severe alcohol drinking can directly hurt heart health. How aging and heavy drinking affect the liver's ability to handle alcohol. So we have standard tolerance. So when you start to drink regularly, eventually you need more to get the effects of the alcohol. But as a person who's been drinking for a really long time continues to drink, then we actually have a reverse tolerance because the body's filtration system can no longer handle the years and years and years of drinking. As the liver gradually ages and is stressed and poisoned over time by alcohol, its capacity to metabolize alcohol is diminished to the point where an older chronic drinker can get tipsy from just 1 or 2 drinks. Brain scans are amazing and they can show us exactly what is happening and the precise effects of substances on the body. So here we have a brain scan of a 15-year-old male who isn't drinking, and then we have a 15-year-old male heavy drinker. The red and pink areas show brain activity during a memory task. Brain activity in the heavy drinker is greatly suppressed, indicating potential problems later in life, especially because at 15, the brain has not developed certain pathways. With really heavy chronic drinking, a syndrome called wet brain can happen, which is permanent. So there are other problems with alcohol, including polydrug abuse. Alcohol is used with many other psychoactive drugs to enhance, counteract, or change the effects. The slang term for that might be crossfading. Taking, very commonly, smoking marijuana and then drinking alcohol, called a crossfade. There's a band called Crossfade. In one study, 80% of the participants used alcohol and marijuana together, and up to 70% smoked cigarettes and drank. So we do know that smoking cigarettes constricts the blood vessels and lowers the BAC, so you're not going to feel the effects of alcohol as much, and you can drink longer. So that's one of the reasons why you will often see smoking and drinking going together. In one study, 80% of the participants used alcohol and marijuana together, and up to 70% smoked cigarettes, crossfading. And uppers such as cocaine or methamphetamine and alcohol are combined to make a speedball, which is used to counteract the depression that chronic alcohol use can induce. This is different than the speedball, which is cocaine and heroin in the same syringe. A Seattle speedball is where you drink coffee and smoke marijuana at the same time. Okay. Most people who use and abuse drugs also drink alcohol, and most alcohol abusers use other drugs. In one European study of 600 adolescent drug users, 80% used both marijuana and alcohol. In the United States, 58% of heavy drinkers smoke cigarettes, while only 16% of non-drinkers smoke. One of the reasons this is important to recovery is if you're vulnerable to addiction, you can be vulnerable to developing habits with substances that weren't your primary drug of choice. And with alcohol, it lowers your inhibitions. And so everything might seem like a good idea when you're under the influence of alcohol. One of the things that I've noticed from my years in being a drug counselor is it's a fairly common phenomenon for meth users who hadn't used alcohol a lot years later, maybe 10 years later, to develop full-blown alcohol problems. And they're surprised by this because they said, my drug of choice was an upper. I've never really used alcohol before, and they become full-blown alcoholics. And one of the theories about this is that if you are vulnerable to addiction with one substance, then you're vulnerable across the board. And so that's why a lot of drug counselors are going to, and especially in abstinence-only models, and there absolutely is scientific truth to this, you do need to be careful if you are vulnerable to addictions and experimenting with other substances. Now, a lot of people do go back to moderate drinking, but some people just can't. Right. Alcohol is used to change mood or mental state. It is a depressant, so the incidence of depression in heavy drinkers, often alcohol-induced, is 5 times that of the general public. Anxiety is a condition found more than twice as often in heavy drinkers, which is interesting because people will say that they drink to curb anxiety. Pre-existing mental problems must be treated at the same time as alcoholism to avoid a relapse. Symptoms of alcoholism can be confused or obscured with those of certain mental health, thought, mood, and personality disorders. The lifestyle of a heavy drinking pregnant woman, nutrition, and violence has as much of an effect on the fetus as the alcohol itself. Fetal damage during pregnancy from fetal alcohol syndrome, FAS, and other fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, FASDSs, is very common. The lifestyle of a pregnant woman who is using can have as much of an effect on the fetus. And this is true for domestic violence. Fetuses that are exposed to domestic violence tend to have problems later on in life. FASD is signified by a combination of symptoms such as retarded growth, facial deformities, CNS problems, and a history of prenatal alcohol exposure. Okay. The spectrum includes FAS, fetal alcohol syndrome, PFAS, partial fetal alcohol syndrome, ARND, alcohol-related neurodevelopmental disorder, ARBD, alcohol-related birth defects, and fetal alcohol effects, FAE, a designation that are rarely used today. The victim, the perpetrator, and one or more bystanders are involved in any act of violence. With aggression and violence, a predisposition to anger and violence is magnified or triggered by alcohol use. So I'm sure we've heard of people saying, oh, they're an angry drunk. So remember that alcohol can potentiate and magnify what's already at the surface level. There are 3 major kinds of interpersonal violence: emotional, physical, and sexual violence. 34 to 74% of those convicted of sexual assault had been drinking at the time of the crime, as had 30 to 79% of the victims. And if you remember from the uppers chapter, if cocaine is involved, it can create a blackout rage, and it's been linked to elevated domestic violence incidences, cocaine and alcohol together. It is Washington state law that if you are in treatment, you receive information on the effects of drinking and drugs during pregnancy. That is actually written into our law about what we have to teach about in treatment. $1.5 million drivers are arrested each year for impaired driving. The average BAC is 0.16, which is twice the legal blood alcohol concentration limit of 0.08. About 30% of traffic fatalities involved alcohol use, mostly beer. Distracted driving, such as texting while driving, is as dangerous as a 0.1 BAC. Isn't that something? We've also been seeing increased traffic accidents caused by opiates and other substances as well. But again, alcohol is definitely public enemy number one when it comes to deaths. And this statistic, teenagers are the most dangerous time for them is when they're in a car. And a lot of adolescent death has to do with alcohol-related death, especially car accidents and accidental drowning. So remember that depending on how much you have to drink, it can really suppress your central nervous system, the respiratory system, and make it difficult for you to coordinate your muscles. So if you are swimming and you're intoxicated, you're at a much, much higher risk rate for drowning. And then people like to do things like get up on roofs and jump and things like that when they're intoxicated. And again, the risk for injury is exponential at that point. 15 to 25% of emergency patients tested positive for alcohol. 31% of boating fatalities had a BAC of 0.1 or higher. 40% of industrial fatalities and 47% of injuries involved alcohol. And suicide rates are twice as high among alcoholics as in the general population. And do remember that substance use and suicide are risk factors for each other. The rate of alcoholism in Russia is extremely high, as is the incidence of fetal alcohol syndrome. These two children at an orphanage outside of Yelisovo and Kamchatka, Russia, have FAS identified by their facial abnormalities. Okay, so we see wide nose, the eyes, undefined features. In a few areas of Russia, the rate of fetal alcohol syndrome disorder, which also includes fetal alcohol syndrome and other less severe alcohol-induced disorders, is more than 50% of all births, which is incredibly high. So here we have a normal brain of a human newborn who died in a car accident, and then a brain of a child born with fetal alcohol syndrome. So you can see that it's very malformed and significantly smaller. More subtle damage can be missed on a brain scan. Alcohol and drug abuse is linked to family violence. We spoke a little bit about this earlier. Remember that the figures might not be completely 100% accurate because many abusers take more than one substance. We've mentioned cocaine previously. 3 out of 4 of those arrested for family violence tested positive for alcohol, so 75%. Half had used some illicit drug, and more than 1 in 4 tested positive for cocaine. So again, when cocaine and alcohol are combined, we tend to have more aggression and linked to domestic violence and family violence. The culture of the drinker, ethnic background, gender, age, and socioeconomic factors help determine how a person drinks. Cultures are defined as wet, France and Italy, dry, Denmark and Finland, mixed, the United States and Germany, or abstinent, such as Islamic countries. The use of vodka in Russia has caused large segments of the population to have problems with alcoholism. It is consumed mostly between meals. Chinese families generally do not drink as much as those living in Western countries. In Japan and South Korea, the social pressure to drink is significant, but the rate of alcoholism is half of that in the United States. Later on in this course, we'll go back to the Van Wormer book, and you will see a little bit more in depth um, race and ethnic and gender contributions and factors to drinking patterns. Women are more likely to die from alcoholism than men. The younger someone starts smoking or drinking, the more likely he or she will have an addiction problem with cigarettes or alcohol and engage in unsafe sexual practices. Drinking patterns are continued from high school to college. 40% of college students admit to binge drinking, 40% get drunk at least once a month, and 29% get drunk 3 or more times per month. Older Americans have the lowest prevalence of problem drinking and alcoholism. Side effects are increased if someone is ill or taking certain medications. Elderly alcohol abusers are of the late onset variety. So again, we want to look at patterns of use when somebody started and the reasons for that. A person arrested for a DUI for the first time has already driven drunk on average about 80 times. They just haven't gotten caught until then. I once had someone that I did an assessment on, and this was their 4th DUI, and they said to me, I don't drive drunk very often. I've probably only driven drunk 10 times, so I think I'm doing really well that I've only been caught 4 times. And as a professional, you just kind of take a deep breath and scream on the inside and blink and then redirect and say, well, these are the consequences, and etc. This person was definitely in the pre-contemplation stage of change, and I don't think that they were going to change it anytime soon. But I found that to be interesting when we see this statistic. They've already driven drunk about 80 times. And when you start to do assessments on people, the casual attitude of, oh, it's no big deal, is probably going to scare you. And then driving becomes a very, very scary place to be. Okay. Medical examiner reports indicate that alcohol dramatically increases the risk of non-automobile involved injuries. Emergency room studies confirm that 15% to 25% of emergency patients tested positive for alcohol, with relatively high rates among those involved in fights, assaults, and falls. Alcoholics are 16 times more likely to die in falls and 10 times more likely to become burn or fire victims. The U.S. Coast Guard reported that 31% of individuals involved in boating fatalities had a BAC of 0.1 or more. And in the workplace, up to 40% of industrial fatalities and 47% of injuries involved alcohol. I know I repeated that, but it's pretty stark. Okay. And with this statistic too, that's just alcohol. We're not counting opiates or marijuana or other substances here. So when we look at poly use, it becomes a little bit scarier. The rate of those in the military seeking treatment for alcohol dependency has gone from 7.2% to 11.4% per 1,000 active duty soldiers. Excess alcohol consumption costs the U.S. military more than $1 billion per year, with medical expenditures accounting for 42% of the total. 30% of the homeless population have drug and alcohol problems. That might be a little bit low as reported, and it would probably depend on what area that you're in as well. In the United States, the per capita consumption of pure alcohol is 2.2 gallons, but as this chart shows, the rate has varied widely with the rise and fall of prohibition movements, health concerns, and the availability of a good water supply. So once again, geography, access to clean water, climate, all of these do play a major role in consumption patterns. Of all the ethnic groups in the United States, American Indians have the highest rate of alcoholism, followed by whites, Hispanics, blacks, Pacific Islanders, and finally Asian Americans. and that has a lot to do with biology. The lower rate of heavy drinking in the Black community is due to a large extent to the long history of spirituality, a valuable concept that aids recovery and is considered a protective factor. The Hispanic community will grow to 24% of the U.S. population by 2050, with 60% of Mexican origin, 9.5% Puerto Rican, and 3.2% Cuban. There is a lack of culturally relevant treatment facilities. Asians and Pacific Islanders have the lowest rate of drinking and drug problems in the United States, mostly due to cultural disapproval of excessive drinking. American Indians and Alaska Natives have a high rate of drinking among certain genetically vulnerable tribes, especially if they are living in poverty. Alcohol abuse accounts for 5 of the 10 leading causes of death in most American Indian tribes. In conclusion, humanity has had tens of thousands of years to adapt to alcohol and develop a culture of drinking. Did not happen overnight. To a certain extent, the restricted legality and limits on drinking have worked. Alcoholism can take from 3 months to 30 years to develop, so it is important for drinkers to assess their current level of use and their susceptibility to compulsive use. And there are phone apps and computer apps that can help you track your drinking. There are moderation programs out there and conscious drinking programs, so that if you don't necessarily consider yourself to be an alcoholic, but you want to cut back, there are ways that you can do that with and without medication. One of the things that I do want to draw attention to is how prevalent alcohol is. In France, several years ago, they did a social media experiment. They created a fake model, and she wasn't a real person. She was a paid model, gave her a fake name and everything. And they created an Instagram account, and they posted a picture every single day for a year, and nobody noticed. But in every single picture, she had a glass of alcohol, some type of mixed drink, usually very glamorous looking. The account's been taken down. You might be able to find it, but it's kind of difficult to. But it was a public publicity campaign to draw awareness to how pervasive alcohol is, especially with glamorized lifestyles, Instagram, etc. And most people didn't realize that this wasn't a real person. So it definitely did what it was supposed to and brought a lot of awareness around. So I apologize for the cat distractions. I hope you enjoyed this, and I will see you next week.